Seniors at St. Michael Academy in Petoskey, Michigan take modern literature. And the first thing to note is that modern doesn't mean contemporary, because it turns out we're actually postmodern people. So here are some of the modern authors our seniors read. Charles Dickens, Great Expectations, Goethe's Faust, Part 1, Dostoevsky, Notes from Underground, and The Brothers Karamazov, which they've just finished here on March 27th. George Orwell's 1984, short stories by Flannery O'Connor and G.K. Chesterton. So just to name the main authors and works that we walk through senior year. Now, we said those are modern authors, so they are dealing with the modern problems, and we can think about those maybe as a series of tensions, whether they're apparent tensions or real tensions, remains to be seen. But here are a few of those modern problems. So faith versus reason, faith versus our rational capacity, free will and determinism, the existence of God, especially in the face of an increasingly powerful modern scientific method, empirical method, and a rational material reductionist philosophy that increasingly edges out any belief in the transcendent and in the supernatural. So the existence of God, the advent of two terrifying, destructive forces, which are still alive and well today in the 21st century, but nihilism, so the belief in nothing, and totalitarianism, right? The sort of thing we saw in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And then finally, self and other. So are we isolated egos, thinking little things trapped in our own heads, with an impassable gulf between us and the people around us? And how do you even know the people around you are real? So that's one version of the self. Or are we connected? Are we deeply connected, like the church has always told us? And do we actually find our meaning in the other, and in the kenosis, or the emptying of our ego, and a self gift, right? As the church teaches us, is that the source of happiness for human beings, and not a grasping and hanging on to the ego? So these are some of the problems that these modern authors wrestle with. Now, how do we approach them? So class is fairly simple. We read these books, we discuss them, and the students write about them, and that's about it. And then the whole thing is a conversation, first of all, between us and these authors, and then between us and each other. And speech and writing and thinking are all part of that. So that's what we do, and it's fairly simple. Now, what are we trying to do with these texts? So how are we approaching them? And that's difficult, but I can start with what we're not trying to do with senior English. We're not trying to train the students to become mediocre poets no one will ever read, so they can narcissistically pat themselves on the back in that way. We're not trying to tell them that they'll get on their own TED Talk by emulating these great authors, and why would you want to do that anyway? And there's nothing wrong with creative writing. It's just not the purpose of the class. We're not trying to. So you can look at these authors and their books as foundational texts in some sense for the West, insofar as we can speak of a unified West. And so something like Homer's Odyssey, that's a foundational text, or the Gospels, right? The Gospel of John, that's a foundational text. So we're not trying to deconstruct these foundational texts and pull them apart and show all the ways in which they're corrupt and wrong and fundamentally after the acquisition of power. That's not what we're doing, and that's a fashionable kind of postmodern thing to do with these Western texts of the Western canon. But we're not doing that. And hand in hand with that, we're not trying to adopt these texts for our political purposes and become activists. And that goes for right or left. These great authors, these genius authors, were not fundamentally politicians, I don't think. And where politics show up in these novels, in these works of literature, it's not the main focus. Someone like Dostoevsky wasn't simply after a political program or out to promote a certain political agenda, even though he deals with politics because he's dealing with the situation in his day and age. But we're not trying to reduce these things to political slogans or tools for winning debates. That's certainly not what we're after. And likewise, we're not looking to support our own narrow worldviews. So we're not sifting through these texts trying to find things that bolster our presuppositions necessarily, because we're young. I'm 24, and the students are 17 or 18. Now is not the time to be right about everything in the world. Now is the time to learn, and to learn from some of the greatest minds in the Western, Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian tradition. And so we're looking to be challenged too. That's one of the things about all these texts the students are reading, is they're challenging, and they don't say just what you want them to say, if that makes sense. And you're meant to wrestle with them and learn from them ultimately. And finally, we're not just getting through it, right? It's not just senior year English to blow off and read a few books and write a few meaningless papers and get on our way and get out of high school. That is absolutely not what we're after. And here's what I think we are trying to do. We're trying to let these texts speak to us, right? So again, let some of the greatest minds in literary history speak to us, because we can learn from them directly. And here's how that happens. We do our best to get inside these texts and to read them very closely, and to figure out what they're saying and how they're saying it. And part of that is to be able to articulate ourselves. What do these mean? Because the process of explaining, both in conversation and in class dialogue, as well as in writing, the process of explaining what you think something means, or what you've discovered that a certain text means, that is the same thing as thinking, you could say. And that's how you ultimately discover what these things mean. And they're not easy texts. Because here's how I think you have to think about these authors, these genius authors. So here's maybe a way you could think about someone like Dostoevsky. He's, again, a genius with this genius capacity for observation and written expression, verbal expression, and that's what he does. And he's looking at the world around him and observing it and realizing things, or learning things about it, and maybe even things that he's not able to articulate explicitly, but they're going into his craft. And so these literary figures, you can maybe think of them as being on the frontier of what human beings know. They've got a foot out into the unknown, and they're discovering things. And it's not like reading a philosophical text or a scientific text or a textbook or a cookbook or something, because again, this is unarticulated knowledge maybe. And so what they're doing is they're embodying things that they know, right? That they've realized in their genius. They're embodying it in dramatic form, whether it's a novel or a play like Faust, or a short story or a poem. They're putting information into drama that then has to be articulated by, and that's what we're doing. We're trying to figure out what they're saying, because it's not something that you can sum up in a nice little sentence, right? There's always a process of conversation that has to go with reading these texts. And again, they're difficult, and they don't yield up their meaning easily, and they're inexhaustible in some sense. So, and I'll leave off with this. I think I would be remiss if I were approaching something like a Dostoevsky novel thinking like, okay, students, I know about this novelist and this novel, and you don't. Here are the 6 things you need to know about the brothers Karamazov and Dostoevsky, and you better know them. And that's that. In some sense, that would be to infinitely distort the text, I think, and reduce it to something like a manual or a Wikipedia page, and that would be to mangle it beyond recognition. So we're always more concerned, and I'm more concerned with thinking through these texts with the students. So as we go along, what do these words mean? What is he saying? And can we explain how meaning is conveyed? And in some sense, it's more important for the students to see me thinking through the text by explaining it to them than it is for me to tell them what I know about these authors, if that makes any sense. Because at the end of the day, these texts are inexhaustible in some sense, and that's why they're the great books, and that's why we read them. So thank you for watching. Hope you enjoy.